Imagine a nation with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Iraq. A nation that for decades has struggled with political turmoil, economic collapse, and deep social divisions. A nation that once supplied oil to the world, including the United States, but now finds itself entangled in a geopolitical clash involving great power competition, economic sanctions, ideological conflict, and military confrontation. That nation is Venezuela. In late 2025 and early 2026, the United States launched what its government described as a law enforcement and counter-narcotics operation against Venezuela. U.S. forces struck Venezuelan military and infrastructure targets and ultimately captured President Nicolas Maduro, bringing him to New York to face drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges. This was the most direct U.S. military action in Latin America in decades, and its implications are world historical. But what lies behind this dramatic intervention? Was it just about drugs? About democracy? Or something deeper, something fundamentally linked to energy and power? Today, we're going to dive deep into the real story behind the U.S. Venezuela crisis, a story about oil, geopolitics, and a shifting world order. So if you like this video, please comment, share, and subscribe our channel for more content. Chapter 1, The Background, Venezuela and the U.S. Relationship. For more than 2 decades, relations between the U.S. and Venezuela were tense and sometimes hostile. Under Presidents Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela pursued socialist policies, nationalized foreign oil companies, aligned closely with Cuba, Iran, Russia, and China, and sharply criticized U.S. foreign policy. Chavez in particular rejected the Iraq War and called U.S. influence in the hemisphere a form of imperialism. In the early 2000s, Venezuela's oil production was still robust, and U.S. refineries imported millions of barrels a day. Over the years, however, mismanagement, corruption, and declining investment plunged Venezuela's oil industry into crisis. Production collapsed, exports declined, and the world lost trust in Venezuela's ability to reliably produce and export crude. By 2025, Venezuela had barely managed to export enough oil to sustain its economy. Meanwhile, the U.S., once a net importer of oil, had become a major oil producer thanks to shale and tight oil, yet still depended on stable global energy flows and prices. Any disruption in major supply sources could affect markets and geopolitical balance. Chapter 2, Why Oil Still Matters. Venezuela's oil reserves are enormous. According to energy data, they represent about 17% of the world's proven reserves, one of the largest in the world. That makes the control and use of those resources strategically significant. Even though the U.S. no longer needs Venezuelan oil to keep its domestic lights on, Venezuela's crude still matters for several reasons: small blue diamond global oil market stability, OPEC production decisions, sanctions on major producers like Iran and Russia, and conflicts in energy-rich regions can shift the balance of supply and demand. That affects global prices, inflation, and economic stability. Small blue diamond geopolitical influence, control or influence over massive energy resources gives any major power, especially the United States, leverage. Energy is not just fuel for cars and factories, it's a tool of foreign policy. Small blue diamond economic and corporate interests. U.S. energy companies historically have had major stakes in Venezuela and would benefit from access to its fields if investment and security conditions were favorable. So while U.S. economic dependence on Venezuelan oil is not what it once was, energy remains deeply entangled in strategic thinking in Washington. Oil wealth still matters to geopolitics. Chapter 3, The Build-up to the Conflict. In 2025, tensions escalated sharply. The U.S. Navy deployed warships near Venezuelan waters. U.S. forces carried out strikes on boats in the Caribbean that they said were linked to drug networks. The U.S. started seizing oil tankers carrying Venezuelan crude under sanctions. President Trump ordered a blockade on sanctioned oil tankers entering or leaving Venezuelan ports. The U.S. government repeatedly framed these moves as efforts to combat narco-terrorism and criminal trafficking. Venezuela's government, however, saw them as economic warfare and an attempt to strangle the country's lifeblood, oil revenue. And on January 3, 2026, everything changed. Chapter 4, Operation and Capture of Maduro. In the early hours of January 3, U.S. forces carried out coordinated strikes and operations across Venezuela, targeting military sites and critical infrastructure. They captured President Nicolas Maduro and flew him to New York, where he was placed into U.S. federal custody on charges of narco-terrorism. This was an unprecedented step, the forcible removal of a sitting president, and it sparked a huge international outcry. At the United Nations Security Council, nations including Brazil, China, Russia, Cuba and Colombia condemned the move as a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and international law. In Washington, Trump's defenders argued this was not an invasion but a continuation of a law enforcement operation, though critics highlighted that such an operation without congressional authorization and using force crosses into the realm of military action. Chapter 5, Official Rationale versus Strategic Interests. The U.S. government offered a few official justifications. Narcotics. Venezuela was accused of facilitating drug trafficking through criminal networks linked to high-level officials, including Maduro himself. U.S. prosecutors claimed narco-terrorism conspiracy. Terrorism claims. Trump's administration designated elements of Venezuelan institutions as foreign terrorist organizations, giving legal grounds for more aggressive action. Human rights and democracy. Some U.S. officials pointed to Venezuela's authoritarian governance, economic collapse, and repression of political opposition, but beyond the declared reasons, analysts and international voices pointed to economic interests, especially oil, as a central factor in the timing and nature of U.S. engagement. Colombia's foreign minister explicitly stated that the intervention has to do with economic interests. The need for oil for an economy like the US's and highlighted how Venezuela's oil reserves were at the heart of the crisis. Trump himself said that Venezuela would supply millions of barrels of oil and that the revenues would be controlled under US oversight, linking the intervention directly to energy management. Chapter 6, Was it about Nobel Prizes? Some narratives circulating online, especially on social platforms, claim that the intervention was triggered by a Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado and personal grievances from President Trump. But there's no credible evidence that the Nobel Prize directly caused the U.S. military action. The intervention was already unfolding through months of escalations involving oil tankers, sanctions, blockades and military buildups before that award was announced. The Nobel Prize may have symbolized international support for the opposition, but it was not a trigger in strategic terms, so no, this crisis wasn't simply a reaction to a Nobel Peace Prize, but rather the culmination of long-standing geopolitical tensions and strategic calculations. Chapter 7, The Global Stakes. The U.S. Venezuela conflict is not happening in a vacuum. Several broader geopolitical dynamics are at play. Small orange diamond U.S.-Russia rivalry. Russia has long been a key ally of Venezuela, providing political support, military cooperation, and economic ties. Russia condemned the U.S. seizure of a Venezuelan-linked oil tanker as illegal piracy. China has invested in Venezuelan oil and infrastructure and opposed U.S. actions as violations of sovereignty. Small orange diamond shifting energy markets. As the world transitions toward renewable energy and diversifies away from dependency on traditional oil markets, control over legacy fossil fuel resources still matters strategically, especially for market stability, pricing power and global influence. This conflict illustrates how resource control, great power competition. Chapter 8, What's next? The situation remains fluid. Venezuela's government still resists U.S. control. Oil exports may be negotiated under U.S. oversight. International law debates about sovereignty and aggression continue. Latin American governments are closely watching the precedent this sets. The U.S. has signaled it does not seek permanent territorial control, but its willingness to manage oil production and revenue is itself a form of economic control, and a reminder that energy resources can still shape foreign policy in profound ways. The real story: so why did the United States intervene in Venezuela? The answer isn't one single motive but a convergence. Geopolitical strategy to counter influence from adversaries like Russia and protect U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. Counter-narcotics and legal actions used publicly to justify operations and target criminal networks allegedly tied to state actors. Control and influence over energy resources arguably the central strategic threat, given Venezuela's vast oil reserves and the U.S. desire to manage energy markets and leverage. A chessboard of global power, where oil, diplomacy, and military force intersect. What we see in Venezuela is not merely an invasion or a law enforcement action, it's a geopolitical pivot shaped by energy dynamics, historical power structures, and the enduring realities of global competition,